back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the Civil War. And in the previous lecture, we talked about each side, North and South, on the eve of the Civil War and some of the advantages and disadvantages they possessed. In this lecture, we're going to continue with the early stages of the war, broad thinking and planning and mobilizing for the war in terms of raising armies on both sides, and also thinking a little bit about the diplomacy of the Civil War. After the initial shots fired at Fort Sumter, both sides anticipated a relatively quick and perhaps one-sided war. Saying that, though, each side still needed to raise and improve upon the armies that they already possessed, such as the Union Army, which had about 16,000 soldiers as the war started. And Abraham Lincoln, after the attack at Fort Sumter, immediately put out the call for an additional 75,000 volunteers for 90 days' service, which again suggests the thought of a quick victory. There were many who responded to that call, including some African American soldiers who initially were turned away at the risk of influencing the border states, which we're going to be talking about shortly. Introducing African American soldiers perhaps might have driven some of those border states towards the Confederacy. Now, eventually, African American soldiers will fight in large numbers during the Civil War, but not at the outset. It was perhaps more of a challenge for the Confederate Army to make its origins for a number of different reasons, one of which is that as the war started, there was no Confederate Army. Unlike the Union, the Confederacy was a new nation just starting out. And also it was perhaps more difficult for a centralized government in the South to raise one unified army. So initially, the Confederacy pieced together state and local militias and eventually put out a call, much like the North, for volunteers to join the Confederate Army, and they also created a Confederate Navy. But in keeping with one of the most dearly held platforms of the Confederacy itself, states' rights, it was a little harder perhaps to justify forming a one national Confederate Army to some of those southern states. And there were elements in the South that held out throughout the war to maintain more of their local and state militias rather than supporting the broader Confederate Army. It was also a great challenge for the Confederate leadership and Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, to pay for the war. Ultimately, the solution was to print money and just keep printing Confederate money throughout the war, which eventually led to severe inflation and the devaluing of that money. As we've mentioned, equipping the Army was a challenge for the Confederacy as well. The North had such great advantages in terms of industry and production. But the South got by and did produce some of their own weapons, imported other weapons that they needed, found others on the battlefield in the aftermath of various battles, and managed to keep themselves supplied, at least through the early stages of the war. I also mentioned the issue of the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and eventually West Virginia as well, which is in this region here. Both sides had a great interest in securing the support of those border states, which were vitally important in a number of different ways. If we look at Maryland and Delaware, for instance, over here in the east, access to that territory provided ready access to a number of important cities, including, of course, the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., but also the capital of the Confederacy, which was Richmond, Virginia, and Philadelphia, which are all in relatively close proximity to each other in that region. But as we look at the other border states as well, these provided access to a number of very important resources, most notably the Mississippi River running here, other rivers like the Ohio River running through this area. So access to those rivers was going to be vital to the war. Those states also contained a relatively large population compared to the rest of the South. If they had joined the Confederacy, the population in those states would have numbered about half of the population of the rest of the Confederacy. And also a considerable amount of the resources and industry. And so if those states had joined the Confederacy, it would have provided a great boon to the South. While sympathies were divided in each of those states, they ultimately all remained with the Union throughout the war, which again was a big benefit to the Union, and more importantly, really deprived the South of what would have been some major advantages, the men and resources that I just mentioned. So fewer soldiers, fewer factories, less industry, and less supplies for the Confederacy. But also, this sort of undermined one of the major arguments that the Confederacy was making about the war being fought to protect and preserve slavery, because each of these states were slave states. And so the thought here is that, well, these four states remained with the Union and they have slavery. So this could be a model, theoretically, for the rest of the South to rejoin and remain with the Union. Just as both sides jockeyed for the support of the border states, they also jockeyed for the support from foreign nations, such as Britain and France. And so there was some question as the war began and through its early stages, whether nations like Britain and France would support the Union side, the North, or the Confederacy, the South. The major question involved cotton, because both of those nations, most importantly Britain, relied heavily on Southern cotton to produce many of their own clothes and other products. Jefferson Davis was relying on this dependence on Southern cotton in the hopes that Britain and France would support the Confederate side. Sort of ironically, and perhaps in a twist of logic, Davis's strategy in this regard was to declare a cotton embargo in 1861. The South would not export any cotton during this embargo. Now clearly, that would hurt the Confederate economy itself because their major export is being shut down. But Davis's gamble was that it would hurt Britain and France even more, and eventually they would come to the Confederate side because they needed Southern cotton. One Charleston newspaper wrote about this, that the embargo would either bring about the bankruptcy of every cotton factory in Great Britain or France, or the acknowledgement of our independence. Now Lincoln and the Union sent emissaries of their own to Britain and France who negotiated on behalf of the Union. And eventually Britain and France both declared their neutrality and said that they would stay out of this conflict. But affairs remained dicey through the early stages of the war, and at times there were incidents even through the war that threatened this balance. As one example, in November 1861, a Union warship stopped a British ship called the Trent, which was carrying a couple of Confederate men who were heading to Europe for negotiations. The Union forces seized those Confederate men, and Britain reacted with outrage. This actually harkens back to the War of 1812 and impressment, which we talked about in some earlier lectures in this course. Now, Abraham Lincoln was able to defuse the so-called Trent affair by releasing the two Confederates and saying that the ship had acted without his authority. But it does illustrate that relationships between the Union and Britain and France throughout the war were delicate.